They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking,
hi, this is Nico. You're listening to my Dad Fall, also known as the White Rabbit and Game Security, and I'm the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Buckle up and enjoy.
deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we were
happy. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole to another edition of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast, now with 100% more Jeff Collins. And as Jeff suggested the topic of this episode, I immediately texted everybody and said, we should all pour a drink, except for you, James. So he's got a coffee mug. I love it. He didn't even bother with like a fancy glass. Jeff's like, I'm just going to coffee mug this thing.
Well, the best part about the coffee mug is what it says.
All right. If you're not watching the video for this one, folks, go back and at least watch that part. That's fantastic. All right. So first off, cheers, and let's get this thing started.
Oh my.
That's how it's going to be. That's how it's going to be.
That's how it's going to be.
We're just going to go. All right. So the topic for today's episode is vulnerabilities that vulnerability scanning has been laid to rest. The funeral is scheduled for Tuesday by Microservices. Jeff, Microservices killed vulnerability scanning has the sound of like video killed the radio star playing in my head. Does anybody else have that?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
As you said it, that's exactly what it sounded like, Rob.
Right. Microservices killed vulnerability. No, okay. I never mind. It still sounds like it. Jeff, tell me where that, like, what chose that topic in your head? How'd you get there?
Well, so it actually popped into my head because of a bunch of conversations I've had over about the last 3 weeks or so. And what's driven it, I mean, all of us have watched kind of the influence of cloud over the last, let's call it 12 years. You know, you think about AWS really taking off about 12 years ago, Azure then coming on, GCP, Alibaba. I mean, kind of the list goes on and on of cloud providers. And then more and more of those services. Raph has a cat that's attacking him right now, for those of you that aren't watching video. But, you know, you think about, so all these microservices have come to be over the last 12 years, you know, more and more functions in AWS speak, Lambda. And, you know, as companies have gone down that path, we've had this whole new realm of how do we deal with risk from an organizational perspective. And vulnerability scanning still is one of those core components. You know, you think about vulnerability scanning, every organization still has them. If you go down and you go and get a cyber risk policy or a cyber insurance policy, you know, one of the core questions is, do you do vulnerability scans?
That's fair.
How do you answer that question if your entire environment's built as functions or in Lambda? You know, do you answer no and not get a policy? Do you answer yes and lie? I mean, these are all real questions that go on. And even when you're not down that path, and if you're just running in an ephemeral environment on top of a cloud provider, you know, what constitutes an effective vulnerability scan? If you have resources that exist less than an hour, should you scan all of those? Should you not? You know, what does that ultimately look like? And that's really kind of what drove this topic is, you know, just like video killed the radio star, you know, we're in a totally different world today within this realm of vulnerability scanning, which is, you know, like I said, in every organization, it's crucial, but, you know, what does that look like?
And a lot of those vulnerability scans don't take in the complexities that exist within the environments. So, for example, something like, hey, I've got cloud SQL servers a lot of the scanners are scanning configuration settings and saying, hey, look, you've got 000/0. This is publicly exposed, but it doesn't take into account that, oh, you've got virtual networks set up within your environment that have it locked down, right? Like there's a lot of complexity that actually goes into what are those scanners doing and what limitations do they have, right? Which adds a lot of extra overhead manual wise to try to solve some of that.
Do you guys feel like this conversation is almost like the death blow of vulnerability scanning? Like it's been progressing, right? And now we're literally sitting having a conversation about, is it really worth it, right? I mean, think about the early days of virtualization of VMware, and all of a sudden you have a large environment, you scan it one day and you got, 1,000 systems. You scan it that afternoon, you got 10,000 systems because everybody's turning on virtual machines everywhere, right? Like, oh, this isn't helpful at all, And then now we're getting to the point where what you're talking about, Jeff, and then James about the infrastructure and the complexity of it. What are you really scanning for, right? And more importantly, how are you going to fix it when it's going to disappear in 17 minutes for the next transaction anyway?
Yeah. So that's an interesting one, right? Reporting is interesting because is a vulnerability a vulnerability? Does it get counted if its lifetime is minuscule and minute?
Or even
right? How long does something have to be there for available to be counted as having a second, a minute, an hour, a day? Where is the line?
And what's the state of the item that you're scanning, right? Because when you start getting into some of these environments, hey, that system's shut down, but it's still getting scanned from a configuration standpoint, right? So am I focusing on this item that is shut down that could be spun up at any given moment? Or am I focusing on the ones that are running, right? Like there a lot of complexity gets added into that of what should you be scanning and how do you report that?
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting is, and one of the things that's always been tough about vulnerability scanning is the reality of generally vulnerability scanning doesn't understand the contextual components of the resource that it's scanning. Everything's just an IP. And so if I scan a machine that sits out on the internet that's just a front-end web server, okay, there's risk with that. But dependent on the configuration of that front-end web server, that risk is rather controlled. But if that machine that's sitting on the internet is an Oracle database server and it has 15 vulnerabilities that lead directly to an easy compromise, what does that risk look like? I mean, those are two distinct ecosystems. And that's one of the huge things that, I think is driving a lot of this is, number one, what the heck are we scanning? Number two, why are we scanning it? And then number three, if we scan it, are we actually able to understand the risk profile of that resource? If you scan something and there's, let's pick on Log4j because it's kind of the last thing that all of us have dealt with at a massive scale. Log4j, exists and you can pick it up on a vulnerability scan, certainly, but you also cannot pick it up on a vulnerability scan. And this is kind of the interesting piece, because just because you have that enabled on a resource doesn't necessarily mean that that resource is using it in any way, shape, or form. And what I mean by that is Apache version, let's say 1.21, has a Log4j vulnerability, but you may not have any of those capabilities supported within your code or with anywhere outside of the fact that Apache has that risk.
That's a fair point too. I'm still stuck on this whole ephemeral objects thing, right? Because from a compliance perspective, what is the answer? Does anybody, if any listening, know how would you report that? If you've got a bunch of, if you've got just microservices such as the function and maybe a couple of Kubernetes instances that you don't, that you're running in a managed cluster that you're not managing, what do you scan? And then how do you report it? Anybody know this? Anybody want to venture a guess?
I think James, I think the timing of it is the biggest problem, right? I mean, even if you did discover something, then what's back to context, right?
Well, and then it drops down to you scan everything, right? And now you're trying to weed through to be able to triage what's there to be able to do it. I mean, you can't sit there and say, oh, well, I won't scan stuff that's in a stopped mode right now because it could spin up tomorrow or it could spin up in 5 minutes. So you got to scan it. You have to understand what it is. Now, I think to Jeff's point, right? What's the context around what are these items? But, this is what makes it really difficult. You start going in and doing cloud scanning and it's like, oh, okay, we don't have to worry about that when it's spun down. Okay, but I can't mark that finding as resolved because they could turn it on tomorrow. And the scanner doesn't tell you the difference between running and not running. It just says there's a vulnerability, right? I mean, same thing with, like the SQL Server example. Okay, we put out there and the scanner identifies and says, hey, it's configured for public access, but we've got a virtual network set up. What happens tomorrow when somebody goes and deletes that virtual network, or they add another virtual network that actually has public access? Now we're back to ground zero of we're vulnerable again. So you can't just be like, oh, well, no, that's mitigated. It's mitigated now, right? And that's if you understand how those configurations are set up.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point because it also brings up a conversation of how much of your environment do you scan? Today, most organizations only scan a portion of their environment. So if you don't scan all of your environment, shouldn't you just scan none of your environment? I mean, that's one of the interesting kind of thought processes is, where do you draw that line? If you have a resource that spins up, let's take Raf's example. Let's say you run a resource for 20 minutes and that resource spins down, but that resource has all of your trade secrets as an organization and has direct access into every component of your backend, is highly vulnerable and can easily be compromised directly into Active Directory. Is that something that you actually should be scanning and know that, hey, Telnet is open on that machine and this is what's going on? I mean, where do we draw that line? And I think that's one of the pieces that's really hard is, if you don't scan everything and you don't understand the scope, shouldn't you rather just scan nothing? And then if you scan everything, how do we get into an environment where we can actually understand what's important? Because adding in more events and adding in more alerts of criticals and highs doesn't really matter. Organizations can't get there today. I mean, if you have 1,000 criticals in your backlog that you're probably never going to be able to get to remediate, and then you scan more and now you have 3,000, the other 2,000 don't really matter because it's just more problems.
Well, it's understanding, I think, what's the scanning that you're doing, right? There's a lot of different scanning we can do of the environment. You do config scanning or something more like a static analysis type of scanning. You can do something more Nmap scans or, something a little bit more advanced than that, where you're actually actively looking for open stuff. And I think that's where it gets critical, because how often are you doing those type of scans? Say you're scanning the entire environment for an active, like say I do an Nmap scan against my system. Am I doing that consistently? Because what was there not 10 minutes ago is there for 10 minutes and then it's gone again. How often are you scanning and missing those items?
Hold on. So this is you guys just kind of hit a bunch of different points, and I'm thinking about what Jim said about is the ephemeral nature of some of what IT is becoming, effectively, killing off what's left of vulnerability scanning. I think both, and then James, you were talking about if it's there and then it's gone, right? It's either torn down or shut down. Because a lot of these environments, they spool up a bunch of resources for processing some data, then data's processing is done, and boom. Think of like your mobile carriers, right? When they push an update to all your phones, what used to be Motorola or whatever, it probably spins up a bajillion instances of software distribution, right? And then they tell the phones, hey, updates available. Well, all these millions of phones check in, they download their updates. And then as that need dives down, it's like, why do we have 10,000 servers? Those all go down. But if you're doing it in a fast enough way, my problem has always been with this conversation in the enterprise world is you've got scanning is like the first small chunk of it, because the rest of it is okay, prioritization and fixing, right? Jeff, you hit that. If you've got a report with 1,000 critical vulnerabilities on assets that no longer exist when it's time to go patch them, you've got a bigger problem than not scanning, because now you're creating a work issue for the people that are that's supposed to go make these fixes, and you're wasting people's time, and that creates credibility problems. That creates all kinds of things because, and I've seen the answers to how do we prioritize, right, from different vulnerability management and scanning vendors on, context and CVE scores, and you can tag and label, and I get that. In a reasonably small environment, that's maybe possible. You get into large environments, you're like, I don't know what that is, but that looks ugly. It's lit up red. It's got 1,000 vulnerabilities. Hey, let's go rescan that thing. Wait, what do you mean it's not there anymore? Like, rescan that. Asset not available. What happened to it? Where did it go? Right? And so was that just a server that was brought up to do some ephemeral work and then it wiped out? Was it an error? Like, we don't know. And so vulnerability scanning becomes effectively the worst possible option that's still left on the table. Because what are the other options, guys? Just to play devil's advocate for a second, like, what are the other options?
I think, what are we using the scans for, right? I think traditionally scans are meant to build vulnerabilities and we pass them off to the teams to fix, right? Hey, we've identified all this, go fix it all. Does it change how we use the scans? One, as more of an inventory of, hey, this is all the stuff that I've got out there, so at least I've got a way to know. And two, more of a root cause. Instead of taking the 10,000 criticals and passing them over, what are those? Is that, hey, we've got container images that have out of date or end of life operating systems or packages on them that we need to have somebody go and address the base images that are being used for these, right? And so no longer are you tackling 1,000 individual vulnerabilities. You're going at it at a, hey, this is the issue we have. Our images are out of date. How do we update those? And does that start working back through the system? So looking at how do we use that information differently than just saying, hey, I've got a bunch of findings, let me throw them over to the teams and go work these one by one.
Yeah, and keep in mind that scanning is actually really old. I mean, it was sort of a byproduct of early penetration testing, which was a method to do, FUD. Well, you need to secure your environment. Well, you're just a geek. I don't need, well, let me just show you. And you hack into it. Then scanning became, we're talking about really early 90s technology philosophies here that have just been tweaked to be faster or more informational. But it is a very old school way of going about things. And then, James, like you talk about, like, we used to call it gold images, and you would use those and say, okay, if you want to fire up a virtual system, you'd use this. But now we're into a scenario where, when you say an alternate scenario, Raf, I think of, like, I'll tell you right now, sometimes what I'm using is, as opposed to traditional scanning, is I leverage EDR, like, hey, I know you're embedded in this system. Tell me what the vulnerabilities are, and it kind of goes back to creating those standard images. But that doesn't work. And then the closer we get to the metal from a virtualization, the less options we have, right? You just kind of slide over code and it runs, which could be vulnerable, and it also could go away in 7 seconds. So the alternate is like stuff something in there that reports back, but even then that's becoming more and more complex.
I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday and we talked about, like, hey, where'd you get started? And he mentioned, you guys remember ISS System Scanner?
Mm-hmm.
Not Internet Scanner, but System Scanner, like with all the TCL tickle scripts that you'd put in and it'd report vulnerabilities. Like, back then, that was an awful idea because it cratered so many systems and it created just weirdness. But I feel like that we've been dragging that mentality. Let me ask this from a different question, because we're all thinking about systems that we can reach and that we know. Jeff, I want to pose this to you, because this is an area of security that's been pitched to me over the last couple of years. And it's not standard like vulnerability scanning, but boy, is it interesting. What about all the assets that aren't on infrastructure that you own? For example, have credit card, will Amazon, like, right? Somebody says, I'm going to use a corporate card, go spin up some resources in a container in an Amazon account that corporate doesn't know about. Like, oh, I just need to do some work. Or domains that are purchased out there, or connected IP addresses, connected systems that aren't on our infrastructure. The what they call attack surface management, I think, is the ASM, right? But finding that stuff at any reasonable scale and then incorporating it back into traditional vulnerability scanning has not worked well. Jeff, I'm sure you got something to say to that one because you're smiling.
It's interesting. I mean, it's like anything that we've dealt with over, let's call it the past 20, 30 years within this space. A lot of the attack surface guys have come out and said, oh, well, we can find all these unknown assets. Well, you can. The problem is that you end up with a lot of false positives as you're going down that path. Because if you try to figure out, an asset, let's take Raf's example of a credit card. Bob goes in, uses a credit card, spins up an AWS account, and spins up a whole bunch of resources with no security groups and puts all the company's data on that. Great and really, really, really bad. There was probably a great business reason why Bob did that. There's a really bad outcome that's going to happen because all the company's data is sitting on an unprotected machine with literally every port open to the entire world. The reality is that how do you then go and find that machine? Well, how the industry's tried to do it is you look at a couple of things. One is, are there URLs that are attached to the company that point to that? Well, if Bob's spinning this up, there's probably not. Bob probably hasn't taken, www.xyzcompany.com/come own me. Bob probably hasn't done that. But the reality is that, the next avenue and what we often see is, well, let's look at, let's look at registrations. Maybe it's other domain registrations registered by the same entity. Well, that doesn't really work well because most people register privately. They register with a third party because they don't want everybody and their brother spamming them, which is a pretty smart thing to do. And then, you kind of go down the next path, which is, well, let's look at IPs that are associated with the company. Well, that's generally a pretty bad thing as well, because most of us want to stop reverse DNS entries of IPs that point to our company. Because if I'm going to go after xyzcompany.com and I look for all the reverse DNS entries from all the providers, I now can map every single IP that the company has and attack them directly. So that's one of the pieces that's really hard about this space, is finding those unknown assets without creating a ton of false positives. An example is I've done a ton of testing over the years with most of these technologies, and they'll come back and I'll insert, information related to a company that we're consulting for, and it will find that basically like every AWS IP address in the world is attached to this company. And it's not necessarily every IP address, but it's enough to cause a problem. I mean, when you have, an AWS environment with 500 elastic IPs, and then all of a sudden the, unknowns is 35,000 IPs, we have a problem. And then it's, how do you figure out which ones are the actual ones we own and which ones are the ones that are owned by every other company on the planet? And that, those are the big issues that go on. And, we've dealt with this forever with unknown IPs or unknown addresses inside of our environments. I mean, if you think about today, the statistic I always hear is that there's 50 IPs associated with every single person, or 50 devices that have an IP associated with every person on the planet. That is a big problem. We were constrained forever because within IPv4, we only had, let's call it 7 billion possible IP addresses. Well, then we decided to create IPv6, which solved the IP problem, but it allowed us to now add in IP addresses across the board. And oh, by the way, the IP space in IPv6 is so big that if we went down the path of our legacy vulnerability scanners that we started this conversation on, they can't even deal with this. I mean, they're used to dealing with 256 or 512 IPs at a time. And now we're telling it, hey, by the way, we're actually going to give you a /48 in IPv6. And the scanner's like, I'll just die right now. It just gives up. It just shuts down. It's like death. It's like the blue screen. We get
Right.
blue screen of death, and that's the end of that. And so, it's an interesting paradigm that's out there. I mean, one of the things that I talked about before is this kind of contextual piece. And one of the things that's hard, and when I think about this vulnerability scanning realm, there's a couple things that I constantly go to. One of them, and we talked about before, is, why do you vulnerability scan? A lot of people vuln scan simply because it's required by their insurer. That's the entire reason. Number two, because there's some compliance requirement that tells us to do that. We have ISO, we have SOC 2, we have CMMC. Something is telling us we have to go do that. So some third party, not us. We don't care if we vulnerability scan. Someone else told us we should. And the third arena is because we actually care about security. And this is kind of an interesting slippery slope, because you can care about security and not vulnerability scan, certainly. I mean, I think the four of us on this call have many ways, and Jim talked about this before with EDR. You can do this without using a scanner. But the reality is that for many workloads, especially those that hit the internet, we often want to do that to at least just understand our exposure. If we have something publicly facing, we don't have compensating controls around it. By compensating controls, I mentioned, like simple novel ideas like, hey, maybe we have a web server and we put a WAF in front of it. Or we have Oracle database and we put a firewall in front of it. I mean, these are kind of like novel ideas that so often I see that people just don't do.
By the way, I want to interrupt you for a second, because you said a /48 in IPv6, and I'm trying to do the mental math and I couldn't, and so I had to look this up. It is 65,536 times 2 to the 64th power.
It's a big number.
It's a big freaking number.
I mean, remember, I grew up in farm country, so we didn't even learn to count above 100. So, I mean, that's way beyond my capabilities.
That's super. Listen, the idea of, I think the whole industry needs. I don't know. I think the whole industry needs a rebuild, a tear down and a rebuild, right? You're in a garage where you build things, but I really do think that this whole industry of identifying vulnerabilities, identifying issues, really does need a full tear down and rebuild, because the authenticated versus we started with non-authenticated scans, right? Tell you very limited amount of things. Then we moved to authenticated scans, where you gave the scanner the ability to be a domain admin effectively, which I'm not sure who thought that was a good idea, but that suddenly made your vulnerability scanning machines the target of every attacker because your credentials live there. But that still wasn't enough. So then you've got to crawl the internet, crawl connected tissue out there to figure out what are you actually running that may or may not be registered on your local infrastructure, or on even addressable infrastructure that you own. And now we're talking about things that have a short lifetime, ephemeral services, things that pop up and go away in faster than we're able to maybe even finish a scan of that subnet. I can imagine a network where, because we scan ideally, right, not just in Windows, but in real time, right, all the time, continuously. Can you imagine a scanner going through a /24 where there are, developers all day long standing up and destroying assets? It's happily scanning 192.168.1.7, and halfway through that asset is given a die command. It goes away into one, and it goes, all right, well, I guess that's gone now. So it's got half the information. Then it starts dot, and then a new asset stands up on .7. The scanner's like, wait, what? All right, I guess we'll start over. And then that one's got totally new information, and that IP address may be reused 4 or 5 times during the day. That's the problem I ran into when I was doing this, Jeff, is that you'd scan something, you'd give the report, you didn't have machine names, you just had IP addresses. And then somebody would go, well, that IP address is either not there, or I looked at it And that can't have that vulnerability because that vulnerability is in a web server. That's a database server. I'm like, wait, okay, that's weird. How long has that server been there? He's like, a couple hours. I'm like, well, I scanned this 2 days ago. Like, I don't know what was there 2 days ago. But there's a web database server there now. It's like, well, that's a problem. How do we address that? Right. And so this is a whole mess of stuff that's wrong. And I don't know of a really good way to solve this other than like tear it down to the studs and try something different. Like, what's the different?
But I think so. I think that's a really good question, but I don't know it's not solvable. And here's why. And let me give you an example that we've as an industry have relatively solved. Now, James may argue with me on this one, but let's go down an example here.
Uh-oh.
So let's just take static code analysis. Let's take that ecosystem. Historically, when we did static code analysis, any single time that someone, and I'm talking in the perfect world, when someone makes a change to a repo, we go and we scan that. And we understand the risks associated with that. We understand dependency risk. We understand all the risks associated with this code. Now, historically, when we did that, it created a lot of problems. Why? Because we didn't understand where it was actually deployed. Remember, we had no concept of SBOM. We had no concept of CI/CD and how we deal with scanning throughout that entire ecosystem. So we didn't understand from repo to runtime. That was the core problem. Well, a bunch of companies have come out now and have done this. So we have a very comprehensive way of understanding this code at this point in time was deployed to this resource at this point in time, and it ran for this period. So we understand that today, and you can do that today with a lot of technologies that are out there. 5 years ago, you couldn't have ever done that with any SCA tool that was out there. It was very difficult and very hard, and unless you were the Fortune 100, you couldn't afford to do it. Let's take the exact same example here. Let's say you spin up a resource for 10 minutes. Why do you have to not know what that resource is? The reason why people don't know what that resource is because they have terrible inventory systems. Absolutely terrible. What if you could feed that directly into an inventory system that knew that IP address was attached to this exact resource for that 10-minute period? And so if you ran a scan, and let's say it was a web server at that point in time, great. It was a web server for that 10-minute period. And if 27 minutes later, you use that same IP address again, and that was a database server, and you scanned it, that IP address is attached to that database server. And you store that information. And so now when you surface those risks, when it was a web server, maybe only port 443 was open. Great. When it was a database server, maybe port 443 was also open. Could be really bad, could be okay. If nothing on the machine responds to it, it's probably okay. Those are kind of the reality pieces. And so I think we need to take some of the things that we've dealt with from a security perspective and think about them in different ways. Flame suit on, feel free to kill me now, James.
No, I don't disagree, right? We've come a long way with how we can go ahead and handle some things, especially when we talk about SCA and some of that stuff. Static analysis itself, as far as at the code level, I don't see as much, of that being able to get all that context. We still miss a lot of that context at the time, right? Because I go check something in, it hasn't been deployed anyplace yet, right? I know maybe where that repo is going, hopefully. So I think there's a lot of improvement that has happened through there. But I agree on the idea that, we need to be able, as an industry, to be better at taking stuff from certain areas and putting it in other areas. We are an industry of, I'll create my own, right? I say it all the time when you talk about pen testing, right? I call it a subset of QA. People have been testing software for decades, and pen testing came along and it was like, nope, we're different. We're going to create our own tools, our own methodologies, our own everything. We won't take anything you've learned over the last 100 years, right? And we see that here with this, right? We're going from regular software scanning or just regular asset scanning to now, hey, this is cloud stuff, this is microservices, this is these different things. And it's like, well, here, we'll go solve that a different way. Or we'll take the old way we did it and we'll just implement that, and we'll complain about it not working because we don't look at some of the enhancements that are coming out to be able to apply that. I think this is where we see, right? I mean, even if you find the vulnerabilities, how do you prioritize them? I mean, there's huge debate in our industry, right? Do we use CVSS anymore? Do we go to KEV? Do we do this? How are we actually looking at these and saying this is a problem versus this is not? I mean, that's a lot of our problem. I think too, you mentioned people scan because of compliance, or they scan because of this, or we had the issue long time ago with antivirus when we were trying to go from antivirus to EDR. And it's like, nobody's making the move because insurance says I need this, or compliance says I need this. And that's not it, right? Even though it may be better, we're being driven by these outside pieces. So, how do we get past that portion of all this stuff being so limited by, well, I fall under this compliance, or I fall under this regulatory, and it says I have to do this. This is the problem with regulations getting too fine, and descriptive about exactly what you need to do.
We should all protect ourselves with Norton. That's the key gist of this entire episode.
All right, Jim, last word to you, sir.
I just think Jeff hit the nail on the head, and so did James, frankly. I mean, my head's about to explode because so many great points were being made. Fundamentally, this is the concept of having like a proper CMDB, kind of like here's the IT side of the world where we're trying to kind of maintain, but we're not really connecting that in a meaningful way because, to James' point, we're not reaching across the aisle, to use a election year pun kind of thing. So there is a lot of opportunity to synthesize information that we have, to your point specifically, Jeff, but we keep sort of hyper specializing security when in fact, really what we need to be is an attribute of all these other things. It's omnipresent, and embrace that omnipresence and become part of these other systems, and we'll move the ball much further down the field as opposed to just running a scanner every month that doesn't tell us anything, right? So it's not that we have to change what we're doing. We have to change how we're fundamentally interacting with the rest of the world, in my opinion.
Imagine if we went to the DevOps side and said, hey, listen, for DevOps, a key component is you have to be able to track everything that spins up and what it was. So we have a history of that. And if that was just what DevOps did, it would start getting implemented because, that's the new thing everybody's doing. But we're not doing that. We're going out and saying, hey, where's security? We'll come up with a solution to track everything that you spin up, right? Like from an outside world, I'm going to figure out how to put that into your system, right? So now I'm building the air filter compartment for your car without having access to the under the hood to be able to make sure, but no, this will fit, right? You can make this happen. And that's where we lose on that, right? Yeah, like we assume we'll make something fit. We're trying to solve the problem that somebody else should be actually solving.
Now I know why, Raph, you wanted us to bring a drink.
See, and I'm done with mine. I don't know about you punks, but I poured short and finished it off. So, all right, hey, that's a good conversation. Thanks, Jeff. Way to pick a good topic to send us off on. Good Lord.
I like to bring great stuff.
Yeah, way to go. Mr. Collins, thank you for joining us. Jim, thanks for being on the show again. James, sorry we gave you that last one to go try to figure out. I think Jeff was just like, huh. Put that one in your court. All right. Folks, thank you for listening. This has been another episode of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast, available on YouTube, where you can see our shenanigans in video form and smiling. And and occasionally my cat decides that it's playtime, and she either tries my lap or she opens all the drawers behind me, and that's hilarious. But until she starts digging in them, and then think it's a whole thing. I have more than once come down in the morning to all my kitchen cabinets being open and my office drawers all being open and half the things on the floor. I thought we had ghosts legitimately for a minute, and so then I caught my cat doing it on camera. I was like, that bastard. Anyway, before we go off onto a tangent, thanks for listening. This has been another Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. We'll catch you guys another time, another place. Cue the music, and we're done.